live in a physical world. Solid. The five senses confirm it. That's what you've known since birth. That's not what she found. Dolores Cannon spent decades putting people into deep trance, past the conscious mind, past the stories we tell about ourselves, down into whatever is underneath all of that. And the people she put under, again and again, describe some version of the same thing. The world isn't fixed the way it looks. It responds. It bends around attention. The wall in front of you feels like the most stubborn fact in the room, but according to what came through in session after session, even the wall is closer to a reflection than a barrier, and the thing doing the reflecting is you. Most people hear a claim like that and file it under nice idea, something for a poster, something to believe in on a good day and forget about on a bad one, harmless, ungrounded, easy to set down. This isn't going to be that. Here's the distinction the rest of this book runs on, so get it clear now, early, before anything else. There's a difference between creating and creating on purpose. You are already doing the first one, right now, today, and every day before this one. Every habit you didn't choose so much as drift into, every outcome you swore was just bad luck, every relationship that played out exactly like the last one, with a different name attached to it. None of that was happening to you. That was you, creating, without noticing you were doing it. Sit with that for a second, because it's easy to slide past. It doesn't mean you're to blame for everything that's gone wrong. Blame isn't the same thing as authorship. A person can write a story badly without being a bad person. They just never learned the craft. That's closer to what's being described here, not guilt, a missing skill. The people Cannon interviewed weren't describing a new ability humans don't have. They were describing the same ability you already have, running on autopilot, unsupervised, most of your life. So set the question of whether all this is true to one side for now. You don't have to resolve that today, and you probably can't, not with certainty, not from a chair listening to an audiobook. Ask a smaller question instead, one you can actually use. If even part of this is right, if attention and expectation shape outcome even a little, what would you stop doing? What would you stop rehearsing in your head, out of pure habit, that you never actually wanted in the first place? That's where the next hour is going. Not in theory, in practice. Not in convincing you of a cosmology, but in showing you what changes when you stop creating by accident. Because the real claim underneath everything Cannon taught isn't mystical once you strip the language off it. It's closer to this. Most people create badly because no one ever told them they were creating at all. They think they're reacting. They think they're unlucky. They think this is just how things turned out, the way the weather turns out, something that happens to a person rather than something a person does. You're not unlucky. You've been unsupervised. This book is the supervision. Chapter 1. Why most people create the wrong thing. Here's the part nobody tells you. You don't get to opt out of creating. That option doesn't exist. The only real choice you have is whether you do it on purpose or by accident. And most people, most of the time, are doing it by accident, because of where their attention goes when nobody's watching it, including them. Think about the last time you were worried about something, really worried. You didn't see the bad outcome once and move on with your day. You ran it, over and over, in detail, in full color, sometimes for days at a stretch. The argument that hadn't happened yet, already lost. The diagnosis that hadn't been given yet, already feared into a dozen different endings. You rehearsed the thing you didn't want, with more discipline than most people bring to anything they're actually trying to build. That's not a flaw in your character. That's just where untrained attention goes on its own. Fear is loud. It demands to be looked at, the way a fire alarm demands to be looked at, whether or not there's an actual fire. And whatever you look at, Cannon would say, whatever energy you give your attention to, is the thing getting fed. Here's an example, the kind that's almost too ordinary to notice. A man is waiting on results from a doctor. For 3 days, he imagines the worst version of the conversation. He hears the tone of voice. He sees the look on his own spouse's face when he tells them. He has, by the time the results come back, mentally lived through the bad outcome dozens of times. Full scenes, full dialogue, fully rehearsed. The results come back fine, and his first feeling isn't relief, it's exhaustion, because part of him had already been living in the version that didn't happen. He spent 3 days creating a future he never wanted, in vivid detail, for free. Nobody told him he was doing that. He just thought he was being careful, thought he was preparing himself. That's the trap. Fear disguises itself as diligence. So here's the quiet, uncomfortable math underneath all of this. It doesn't seem to care whether you want the outcome or not. It responds to where your focus actually lives, not to your preferences about where it should live. You can spend 1 hour dreading a conversation and 1 hour wanting a promotion. And if the dread was more vivid, more rehearsed, more practiced, that's the one with more behind it. Not because the universe is cruel, because practice is practice, regardless of what you're practicing. This is why positive thinking, as a slogan, fails so many people, and fails them quietly, in a way that makes them think the idea itself is broken, rather than their use of it. They try to want something for 10 minutes in the morning, say an affirmation in the mirror, then spend the other 23 hours and 50 minutes of the day rehearsing what they're afraid of instead. The bills, the rejection, the way it always goes wrong. The ratio wins. It almost always wins. 10 minutes of wanting cannot outweigh 23 hours of dreading, no matter how sincerely those 10 minutes were meant. You don't need more willpower to fix this. Willpower is what people reach for when they don't understand the actual mechanism, and it burns out fast because it's the wrong tool. What you need is much smaller and much stranger. You need to notice the pattern while it's happening, not after, once the worry has already run its full course and worn itself out on its own. Here's what that noticing actually looks like in practice, not in theory. You're driving or showering or lying awake, and you catch yourself 3 minutes into a scene that hasn't happened. An argument, a failure, a humiliation, played out start to finish in your head with surprising production value. The moment you notice you're inside that scene, stop. Not feel bad about it, not judge yourself for it. Just notice, the way you'd notice you left a stove on. Oh, I'm doing it again. That noticing, that one small catch, is not a minor thing. That is the actual starting skill underneath everything else this book is going to teach you. Not optimism, not positivity, not forced gratitude. Awareness of where your attention is, in real time, before it finishes building something you didn't ask for. Here's the part worth holding on to. When you notice you're rehearsing something you don't want, that's not a failure. That is the first moment you've ever actually caught yourself creating. Most people never get that far. They just feel anxious, call it a personality trait, and never trace it back to the rehearsal underneath it. You're not anxious by nature. You've been creating, unsupervised, pointed in the wrong direction, for years, without anyone telling you that's what was happening. Now you can see it. And the moment you can see it, really see it, the way you'd see a habit once someone points it out, it already starts to loosen its grip. Not gone, not fixed, but loosened, because you can't run something on total autopilot once you've started watching it. That's where it starts to change. Chapter 2. Focused thought as a skill, not a mood. Most people think focus is a feeling. You either have it that day or you don't. You're in the zone or you're scattered. And which one shows up feels like weather, outside your control, arriving on its own schedule. That's not what focus is. Focus is a skill. Skills are built the same way regardless of what they're for, through repetition, through specific practice, through doing the small version correctly before you ever attempt the large one. Nobody is born able to hold a complex thought steady for 10 minutes without it drifting. People who can do that learned it, usually without realizing they were learning it, the same way someone learns to type without consciously studying the keyboard. So, if creation runs on focused thought, the first real question isn't, what should I think about? It's, can I actually hold a thought steady long enough for it to matter? For most people, the honest answer is no, not yet. And that's fine. That's just the starting point, not a verdict. Here's where Canon's material gets genuinely practical once you translate it out of its original language. Manipulating energy sounds abstract, even mystical, until you break it into 3 concrete components: specificity, repetition without anxiety, and the difference between wanting something and deciding something. Start with specificity because it's the one people skip most often. I want to be successful is not a thought you can hold steady because it isn't actually a single thought. It's a fog made of dozens of half-formed images that keep shifting underneath the word successful. One day it means money, another day it means recognition, another day it means simply not being afraid anymore. A fog like that can't be focused, the same way you can't bring a cloud into sharp focus with a camera. There's no single edge to lock onto. Compare that to something specific. I am running my own small business from a particular building on a particular street with 3 employees I trust. That has edges. You can return to that image the same way each time, holding the same picture, rather than reconstructing a vague mood from scratch every time you try. Specificity isn't a nice extra. It's the actual mechanism that makes a thought holdable at all. Second, repetition without anxiety. This is the part almost everyone gets backward. They think repeating a desired outcome more often, with more intensity, with more desperate emotional pressure behind it, will work faster. It does the opposite. Desperation is a cousin of fear, and fear is what you were taught to starve, not feed, back in the last section. A thought repeated from desperation carries the emotional signature of not having it, of lack, of urgency, of please, please let this happen. That signature is what gets reinforced, not the outcome itself. Repetition that works looks almost boring by comparison. Calm, unhurried. The same specific image, returned to at the same time each day, held for a minute or two, without checking whether it's working yet. Like watering a plant. You don't dig it up daily to inspect the roots. You water it, you walk away, and you trust the process you can't directly see. Third, and this is the one that changes the most once people actually understand it, the difference between wanting and deciding. Wanting has a built-in admission of absence baked into it. You only want what you don't have. Every time you say, I want this, some part of you is also quietly confirming, I don't have this yet. And that confirmation gets carried along with the wanting, attached to it like a shadow. Deciding works differently. A decision isn't asking for permission from circumstances, it's a closed door behind you. Think about the physical difference between someone saying, I want to quit smoking, and someone saying, I've quit smoking. Even mid-relapse, even on a hard day, the second sentence carries a completely different posture than the first. One is a request sent outward, hoping for a response. The other is a fact stated about who you already are. This doesn't mean deciding makes things happen by magic words alone. It means the quality of the thought changes, from open question to settled fact. And that change in quality is exactly what Canon was pointing at when she talked about energy carrying direction. Direction isn't enthusiasm. Direction is settledness. So here's where this becomes something you actually do, not just something you understand intellectually, which is where most people stop and where this book is asking you to keep going a little further. Pick one thing, not 5 things. 1. Make it specific enough that you could describe it to a stranger in concrete sentences, not adjectives. Hold that image for 60 to 90 seconds, once a day, ideally at the same time, the way you'd brush your teeth, not as a peak emotional event, but as routine maintenance. State it to yourself as decided, not as wanted. This is happening, not, I hope this happens. That's the entire technique. It will feel almost insultingly small the first time you do it, because you've probably been taught that transformation requires intensity, long visualization sessions, dramatic affirmations said with feeling, vision boards covered in images. None of that is wrong, exactly, but none of it is necessary either, and most of it accidentally reintroduces the desperation this section just asked you to remove. Small, specific, calm, decided, repeated. That's the actual mechanics underneath the language canon used. Not magic, not mysticism, once you take the language apart. A discipline of attention, practiced the same unglamorous way any other discipline gets built. Slowly, on ordinary days, without anyone watching. Chapter 3. Fear Management as Creative Hygiene. There's a reason this section comes right after the one on focus and not before it. You can learn every technique in the last section perfectly, specificity, calm repetition, deciding instead of wanting, and still undo all of it in the other 23 hours of your day if fear is running unmanaged in the background the whole time. Think of it less like a separate skill and more like hygiene. You don't brush your teeth because it's exciting. You do it because neglecting it quietly undoes other things you care about, your health, your comfort, eventually your confidence in your own smile. Fear management works the same way. It's not the dramatic part of this practice. It's the maintenance that keeps the dramatic part from leaking away. Here's what that maintenance actually involves, broken into pieces you can use rather than just admire. First, separate fear from information. Fear often disguises itself as a warning, and sometimes it genuinely is one. That's worth saying clearly, because the goal here isn't to suppress every uncomfortable feeling as if it were noise. If you feel afraid walking down a dark alley at night, that fear is doing its job. The fear this section is concerned with is a different kind. The rehearsal fear from 2 sections ago, the kind that replays a future that hasn't happened and has no new information in it at all. The test is simple. Is this feeling telling me something true about right now, or is it just replaying an imagined later? One is signal. The other is noise wearing the costume of signal. Second, starve it instead of fighting it. This sounds passive, but it's the opposite. It's a discipline, just a quiet one. Fighting a fearful thought means engaging with it directly, arguing with it, trying to talk yourself out of it point by point. That keeps it fed because you're still spending attention on it. Just attention shaped like resistance instead of belief. Starving it means something different. Noticing it's there, the same small catch from the focus section, oh, I'm doing it again, and then simply not following it any further. Not arguing, not suppressing, just declining to continue the scene. A short example, because this is easier shown than explained. You send an email to someone important and don't hear back for 2 days. The fearful version of this starts writing a story. They're angry. They've changed their mind about you. You said something wrong. This is going to cost you something significant. You can feel that story start to build its own momentum, scene by scene, the same way the worry about the doctor's results built itself in an earlier section. The discipline here isn't telling yourself a more positive story instead. It's noticing the story is starting and quietly closing the file. Not, everything's fine, I'm sure of it. That's just a more optimistic guess, still fed by the same anxious need for certainty. Just, I don't know yet, and I'm not going to write the ending myself. Third, understand what fear actually costs you, beyond the discomfort of feeling it. This is the part most people never connect to creation directly, because fear feels like it only costs you in the moment, a bad hour, a tense day. But every minute spent rehearsing an unwanted outcome is a minute of focused attention spent building that outcome's blueprint instead of the one you actually want. It's not just unpleasant, it's structurally expensive. Time spent fearing isn't neutral time. It's time spent creating, just creating the wrong thing, with real effort behind it. That reframes the stakes considerably. This isn't about feeling calmer for its own sake, the way a meditation app might frame it. It's about budget. You have a limited amount of focused attention in a given day, the same way you have a limited amount of money or hours. Every block of attention fear takes is a block that isn't going toward the specific, decided, calmly repeated image from the last section. Managing fear isn't emotional self-care exactly, though it can certainly feel that way, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's resource management for the same skill this entire book is teaching you to use deliberately. So the practice here is small, the same way the practice in the last section was small. Notice the rehearsal. Ask if it's real signal or imagined later. If it's imagined, close the file without arguing with it. And remember, especially on the days this feels hardest, that every time you catch yourself doing this, you're not failing at the practice. You're doing the practice. The catching is the skill. It was never about never feeling afraid again. It was about not handing fear your full, undivided, expensive attention every single time it shows up uninvited. Chapter 4. The body as feedback, not just vessel. There's a habit most people fall into without ever deciding to, treating the body like background noise, something that carries you from one task to the next, mostly silent, occasionally complaining when something's actually wrong, a headache, an injury, hunger. Useful, but not informative, not something you'd consult on purpose. Cannon's material points somewhere different. In her sessions, the body kept showing up not as a passive vessel, but as something closer to an instrument, something that registers alignment and misalignment, the way a tuning fork registers a note that's slightly off, often before the conscious mind has caught up to what's actually happening. To be clear about what this section is and isn't claiming, this isn't medical advice, and it isn't a healing technique. Nothing here replaces a doctor, a diagnosis, or actual treatment for an actual condition. What this section is about is something narrower and far more usable day to day. Your body as an early signal, a piece of feedback you've probably been ignoring simply because nobody ever taught you to read it as information. Here's what that looks like in practice. You've probably had the experience of agreeing to something out loud, a project, a favor, a plan with a friend, while some part of your chest or stomach quietly tightened the moment you said yes. Most people override that signal instantly, usually without noticing they're doing it, because the social cost of saying no in the moment feels higher than the cost of a vague, unnamed tightness that's easy to explain away. I'm probably just tired. It's probably nothing. And then, 2 weeks later, dreading the thing you agreed to, you remember that tightness and realize it was never nothing. It was the first draft of a no you talked yourself out of hearing. That's the kind of feedback this section is pointing at. Not mystical, not requiring belief in anything. Just attention paid to a signal that's almost always there, almost always early, and almost always overridden by the time the conscious mind finishes its more polite, more socially acceptable explanation for why everything's actually fine. The same signal shows up on the positive side, and people miss this direction even more often than the negative one, because positive bodily signals don't demand attention the way discomfort does. Think about the last time an idea genuinely excited you, not sounded good on paper, but actually had some kind of lift behind it, a lightness, maybe something close to your chest opening rather than closing. That sensation is data too. It's not proof the idea will work. It's not a guarantee. but it's a piece of information layered underneath the purely logical case for or against something. And most people never learn to weigh it at all because they were taught, reasonably in most contexts, that decisions should be made with the head, not the gut. This section isn't arguing for abandoning the head. It's arguing for adding a second source of information the head doesn't have access to on its own. Here's a simple practice in the same small, unglamorous spirit as the last two sections. Once a day, pick a decision sitting in front of you. Small is fine, doesn't need to be significant. Before you think it through logically, pause for 10 seconds and simply notice what your body is doing. Tight or open, heavy or light, contracted or expanded. Don't interpret it yet, just notice it, the way you'd notice weather before deciding whether to bring an umbrella. Then make the decision the way you normally would, with reasoning, with pros and cons, with whatever process you already trust. But hold the bodily signal alongside it as one more data point, not the deciding vote. Over time, almost everyone who does this consistently reports the same thing. The body's signal and the eventual right answer start to line up more often than chance alone would explain. Not perfectly, not as a substitute for thinking, but often enough that ignoring it completely starts to feel like discarding a useful instrument simply because no one taught you how to read its dial. This connects directly back to everything in the last two sections. A specific, calmly held, decided thought tends to come with a felt sense of ease, even when the outcome itself is still uncertain. A thought, still tangled in fear, tends to come with tension, even when the words being said sound calm and confident. Learning to notice that difference in your own body gives you a second way to check your own work, a way to catch, sometimes before you can even articulate why, whether you're creating from the calm, focused place this book has been building toward, or quietly slipping back into fear, wearing a more reasonable-sounding disguise. The body was never just a vessel carrying you from one place to the next. It's been giving you a running report the entire time. This section is just the first time anyone's told you it was worth reading. Chapter 5. Earth School, reframed as Mastery Curve. There's a phrase that shows up across nearly all of Callan's material, stated different ways by different sources, but always landing on the same idea. Earth is a school, and the thing you're here to learn, the thing you don't get to skip or test out of early, is how to create on purpose. You don't have to accept the cosmology behind that phrase for the structure underneath it to be useful. Strip away the metaphysics, the idea of literal incarnations, literal lessons assigned before birth, a literal curriculum overseen by something watching from outside. And what's left is a much more ordinary, much more testable claim. This is a skill, and skills follow a mastery curve. They don't arrive finished. They develop in stages, usually slower than anyone wants, usually with periods that feel like backsliding even when they aren't. That reframing matters more than it might seem to at first, because most people approach something like this book backward. They listen, they feel something shift, they try the practices for 3 days, and when day 4 doesn't look dramatically different from day 1, they conclude the whole thing doesn't work. That conclusion isn't really about whether the underlying idea is true. It's about an unrealistic timeline, borrowed from a culture that markets transformation as something that happens in a single dramatic moment, when almost everything that actually changes a person changes the way muscle changes. Slowly, beneath the surface, invisible week to week, and only obvious looking backward over months. Think about anyone you've ever watched get genuinely good at something physical, an instrument, a sport, a craft with their hands. Nobody watching them in week 1 would have predicted week 100. The early stage is almost always clumsy, almost always slower than it feels like it should be, almost always full of moments that feel like proof the person doesn't have what it takes. And yet, with enough repetition, something that once required total, effortful concentration becomes close to automatic. The fingers find the chord without being told where to go. The first serve goes in more often than not, without conscious calculation. There's no reason to expect the skill this book is describing, focused, decided, calm creation, managed fear, a body read as feedback, to behave any differently. Early attempts will feel deliberate, effortful, easy to abandon. A specific image held for 90 seconds will feel, the first dozen times, like nothing is happening at all. The same way the first dozen attempts at a difficult chord produce mostly buzzing strings and frustration. That's not evidence of failure. That's just what stage one of any real skill looks like. In every domain humans have ever gotten good at anything. This is where the graduation language in Canon's material earns its place once it's translated out of its original cosmology. Graduating doesn't have to mean completing some cosmic curriculum and leaving the planet behind. It can mean something much more immediate and much more useful. Reaching the point where deliberate creation stops requiring so much conscious effort and starts becoming closer to default, the way an experienced driver no longer consciously thinks through each motion of merging onto a highway, where a new driver white-knuckles through the same maneuver with total concentration. Nobody reaches that point by deciding once, dramatically, to change. They reach it the unglamorous way every skill gets reached, by small, repeated, often uneventful practice on days that don't feel meaningful at the time, that only look meaningful added together months later. Here's the part worth sitting with directly, because it changes how you should treat the practices in this book going forward, not just understand them intellectually. If you try the focused thought practice from earlier in this book for 3 days and don't notice anything different, that is not information that the practice failed. That is exactly what week 1 of any mastery curve looks like in every domain anyone has ever gotten good at. The frustration you might feel at that point isn't a signal to stop. It's a fairly reliable signal that you're at the very beginning of something that takes longer than 3 days. The same way frustration in week 1 of learning an instrument isn't a sign you lack musical ability. It's just what week 1 feels like, for almost everyone, regardless of ability. So the practical instruction underneath all of this cosmology, once it's been translated all the way down, expect this to take longer than feels fair. Expect early attempts to feel unconvincing, and treat the absence of a dramatic, immediate shift not as evidence against everything covered so far, but as confirmation that you're exactly where everyone starts, at the bottom of an ordinary mastery curve, doing ordinary, unglamorous repetition, the same way every real skill anyone has ever built actually got built. That's the entire idea behind graduating, not leaving a classroom, becoming someone for whom this is no longer effortful, because you put in the unglamorous, unwitnessed repetition that gets anyone there, in any domain, including this one. Chapter 6. A single daily practice, repeated and anchored. Everything covered so far has been a piece: specificity, calm repetition, deciding instead of wanting, starving fear instead of arguing with it, reading the body as feedback. The patience of a mastery curve that doesn't reward you on day 3. Pieces are easy to understand and easy to forget. So this section exists to do one thing only: take everything above and compress it into a single sequence, small enough to actually do every day, without it becoming one more item on a list you eventually abandon the way most self-improvement attempts get abandoned. Not from lack of belief, but from lack of simplicity. Here is the full sequence, start to finish. Step 1. Notice before you build. Before you do anything else, spend 10 seconds simply checking where your attention has been living for the last hour, not judging it, just noticing. Has it been rehearsing something unwanted, a conversation, an outcome, a fear dressed up as preparation? Or has it been relatively quiet, relatively neutral? This step alone, done consistently, is worth more than people expect, because it's the step that turns unconscious creation into conscious creation simply by shining a light on it. You cannot redirect attention you don't know is already pointed somewhere. Step 2. Choose one specific image. Not a mood, not a vague hope. One concrete picture, with edges, the kind you could describe to a stranger using nouns rather than adjectives. Not, I want to feel successful, but the actual room, the actual conversation, the actual version of a Tuesday morning that would tell you this had already happened. If you don't have one yet, that's fine. Spend this step building it, slowly, the way you'd sketch something before painting it, rather than skipping straight to the painting. Step 3. Hold it without urgency. 60 to 90 seconds. No more is required, and more isn't automatically better. This isn't a competition of intensity. Picture it the way you'd recall a memory, rather than the way you'd beg for a wish. Memories don't have desperation attached to them. They're simply held, calmly, as fact. Borrow that same quality for something that hasn't happened yet. Step 4. State it as decided, not wanted. Out loud if you can, silently if you can't. Not, I hope this happens, but this is happening. Let the sentence carry the settled posture of something already true, not the open, asking posture of something still being requested. This is the smallest step in the sequence, and for most people, the hardest one to do honestly, because it requires temporarily setting aside the part of you that wants proof before it's willing to commit. Do it anyway. The proof, if it comes later. The decision has to come first. Step 5. Notice the body, without forcing a reading. After holding the image and stating it as decided, pause for a few seconds and notice what's happening physically. Tight or open? Heavy or light? There's no required answer here. The point isn't to manufacture a feeling of expansiveness on command, which would just be another form of forcing, another disguised version of the desperation this whole practice is built to avoid. The point is simply to notice, honestly, whatever is actually there, and let that be one more piece of information rather than a verdict on whether you're doing it right. Step 6. Release it and return to your day. This is the step almost everyone skips, and skipping it is what causes most people to unconsciously slide back into fear-based rehearsal within the hour. Once you've held the image, stated it as decided, and noticed your body, let it go completely. Don't check on it. Don't replay it 3 more times across the day to make sure. Trust functions the way water functions. It has to be allowed to settle, not stirred constantly to see if it's settling yet. A seed, checked daily by digging it back up to inspect the roots, never grows. The releasing is not passive neglect. It's an active, deliberate act of trust, and it's just as much a part of the practice as the holding was. That's the full sequence, 6 steps, none of them complicated on their own, most of them takeable in under 3 minutes total once you've done it a handful of times. The difficulty was never in understanding any individual step. The difficulty is in doing all 6 daily on ordinary days that don't feel significant, for long enough that the mastery curve from the last section has time to do what mastery curves do, turn effortful repetition into something closer to default. A few things worth saying plainly about how this will actually go, because false expectations kill more good practices than bad technique ever does. Some days you'll do this and feel nothing in particular. That's fine. Feeling something dramatic was never the metric. The metric is whether you did the sequence, not whether the sequence produced a noticeable internal fireworks display. Skills practiced for feeling, rather than for repetition, rarely survive the days when the feeling doesn't show up. And there will be many of those days, for everyone, regardless of how this is going underneath the surface. Some days you'll catch yourself, hours later, back in a fear rehearsal loop you thought you'd already learned to interrupt. That's not regression. The skill from the earlier sections, noticing the rehearsal, declining to continue the scene, doesn't replace the habit overnight. It exists alongside the old habit for a while, competing with it, slowly winning more of those moments over time. Catching yourself slipping back is not the absence of progress. It's actually a small, specific piece of evidence that the noticing skill is working. Because a year ago, before any of this, you wouldn't have caught it at all. And some days, doing all 6 steps will feel almost embarrassingly simple, even silly, too small to matter, too quiet to be doing anything real. That feeling, specifically, is worth being suspicious of, because it tends to arrive exactly when something is starting to take root beneath the surface, before it's visible enough to convince the part of you that wants proof before it's willing to believe anything. This is the whole practice. Not complicated, not requiring belief in anything beyond a willingness to try it consistently and watch what happens over months rather than days. Notice. Choose one image. Hold it calmly. Decide instead of want. Check the body without forcing it. Release completely. Then go live your day, the same as always, except slightly more awake to what you're doing with your attention than you were before you started. Chapter 7. Close. What changes if you practice this for a year? You won't remember most of this a week from now. That's fine. That was never the point. What matters isn't whether you can recite 6 steps on command. What matters is whether somewhere in the next year you start catching yourself a little earlier. Mid-rehearsal of something you don't want instead of 3 days into it. Mid-decision instead of after you've already talked yourself into something your body was quietly warning you about. That's what this actually looks like, lived out. Not transformation, interruption. Smaller moments, caught sooner. A year from now, if you've done this, not perfectly, just consistently, on ordinary days that didn't feel significant at the time, a few things will likely be true. You'll spend less time rehearsing outcomes you don't want. Not 0 time. Less. The fear will still show up, it always does, but it will hold you less often, for less long, before you notice and decline to keep building it. You'll notice your body's signals before you override them, more often than you do now. Not every time, more times than not. You'll catch the difference between wanting something and deciding something, almost without trying, the way you now catch the difference between sarcasm and sincerity in someone's voice without consciously analyzing it. And you'll probably look back at the version of yourself who started this book and recognize someone who was creating constantly, skillfully even, just never on purpose. Not someone who lacked the ability, someone who'd simply never been told the ability was already running all the time, whether anyone was steering it or not. That's the entire claim underneath everything Canon described, once it's been carried all the way down from cosmology into something you can actually use on a Tuesday. You were never powerless, you were unsupervised. The world didn't need to be solid or illusory for that to be true. It only needed your attention to matter. And it does, more than you've likely ever been told. Start small tomorrow. One image, held calmly. Decided, not wished for. Then released completely, the way you'd release anything you actually trusted. That's the whole practice. That's the whole book.